Hello art students, today I'm going to go over some basic watercolor techniques and tips with you. To get started, you will need a watercolor set that has a mixing tray and a watercolor set that has red, yellow, blue, black, white, and brown. You'll need a brush and your own water container that's about halfway full of water. We're going to be doing a lot of color mixing, and we're going to do that color mixing in the mixing tray or the palette. So I'm going to mix a green by starting with some yellow and then adding some blue to it. Now, depending on how much blue you add, you might get a different green. So play around with it and see what kinds of greens you can create. I have a blue-green here. And the first thing I'm going to think about is how I'm holding my brush. The closer I hold my hands up close to the bristles, the more control I'm going to have. If I hold the brush all the way at the end, I'm going to have hardly any control. And that's really important for this type of project where we want to get up close to the edges and to the lines or outlines of our patterns that we've designed. Now this is a big no-no. You never ever want to scrub your brush. You never ever want to use a brush when it's dried out like that. That tells you that you need way more paint and water on your brush. You always want to have enough paint and water on your brush that it maintains a nice pointed shape so that you have a nice flow of paint. Now, one of the cool things about watercolor is that once you've got some paint down, you can push that paint around and move it up close to the edges without having to add more and more paint. For really small areas or little details, you might want to consider using a watercolor pencil. So I generally put it in the water to activate it and then just use it like a colored pencil, but you'll start getting a flow of water in there that creates a nice little spot of watercolor for you. You can go back in and just dip your watercolor pencil in again. So for that small circle, I would probably use watercolor pencil. Now I want to prevent paint from bleeding because I've done a really detailed pattern here. So to do that, I really want to alternate the areas that I paint, because if I paint wet paint next to wet paint, this is what happens. I get something called bleeding. So what happens with watercolor is that when one area of wet paint gets close to another area of wet paint, they like to come together and run together. And that's a bummer when you've created a really cool design and you want it to look neat and tidy. So we're going to alternate areas. We're going to let paint dry before we paint up next to it. So we're just going to skip over to this area, and I've mixed up a purple by mixing red and blue together. Now again, I'm going to push my paint. Now that I've got some watercolor down, I'm going to push that paint by moving it side to side toward the edge to paint up right close to the edge. And again, I'm holding my fingers close to the edge of the paintbrush, close to that metal part where the bristles come out. So next, I am going to wait for that green paint to dry before I paint this area. So I'm going to skip over to another area and show you a little bit more about how to use the watercolor pencils. The one thing that you can do if you have water pooling is you can blot it up. But the watercolor pencils come in a variety of colors. You can mix them if you like, but they're really best suited for areas of small details, and I'll show you why. So I'm going to dip one in some water, activate it, and you can see that it leaves a texture. It's really cool. You might like that texture, but you might not. And the texture is going to show up more in a larger area than in a smaller area. So it's just something to think about. You can blend colors into it. You can add water once you've got it down and kind of spread it out or push it around. But you can see what it looks like when I add a little bit of a yellow blended into it. So just something to think about. Okay, so if I wanted to mix an orange, I would mix yellow and red together. Like if I wanted to create a whole other section of maybe an orange color, that's something that I could certainly do. But now I'm going to show you what happens if you mix a little bit of black into a color and a little bit of white into a color. So I'm going to mix up a little bit more purple, And then I'm going to add a little bit of black. Black is very strong, so you don't want to add too much. But look at this beautiful smoky gray that I've made by adding a little bit of black to that purple. Next, I'm going to make a pink by starting with some red paint and then cleaning my brush off and adding some white to it. Now I have a nice pastel pink, and you can mix up a lot of other pastel colors by blending a little bit of white, but first you got to make sure you clean off that brush. If you run out of mixing area in your palette, you can take a dry paper towel and just wipe it out, and I'm going to ask you to do that at the end of every class to make sure that your palette is clean. Last but not least, when you are cleaning off your brush, please, please, please do not tap. When you tap, you are spraying water and paint all over the place, including on your neighbors. Please wipe your brush off inside your water container. Do not tap it. Again, tapping it will just spray water and paint and flick it all over the place. So carefully, just wipe off that extra water on the outside of your water container. All right, have fun.